It's a mystery still looming over the Hampton Roads community.
Prosecutors are disappointed with today's results.
The district attorney wanted murder. He got manslaughter.
Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Amanda, and on this channel we talk about all things true crime related. Now, this is part 2 to a two-parter of the Hi-Fi store murders, as you can tell by what you clicked on, part 2. So make sure you watch part 1 before you start part 2. All my social media handles, sources, and ways to support the channel are in the description box if you want to check those out. All right, let's jump back into part 2. When 19-year-old William Andrews was arrested, police brought him into an interrogation room and questioned him on what he was doing the previous evening. Andrews said that he and Pierre drove into Ogden with Keith Roberts, where they dropped Roberts off someplace downtown. He and Pierre returned to base where they watched a movie, Black Belt Jones, and after the movie they went to the 7-Eleven where they got a 6-pack of beer and then returned to base to finish out the evening. He reported that he was in bed by midnight. Police told Andrews that they had a witness who confirmed he did go see the movie Black Belt Jones, but he saw the movie on Sunday night, not Monday night. Andrews said they actually went there both nights. Andrews went on to tell police that he was actually at the Hi-Fi stores on the Saturday before the murders, and he touched a bunch of equipment. So if they find the stolen items, his fingerprints might be on it. Instead of taking 21-year-old Pierre into an interrogation room, they brought him straight to the holding cell until he could be arraigned. This was not Pierre's first time in the police station. He was the prime suspect in the death of another man named Edward Jefferson, a sergeant also stationed at the Air Force Base with them. Jefferson was found on October 5th, 1973, so about 5 months before the Hi-Fi murders, with a pillow over his face and what looked to be like murdered by a bayonet repeatedly being driven into his face. Pierre became the only suspect when police were able to interview some of Jefferson's friends. It was discovered that Pierre had been over to Jefferson's house taping some music when Jefferson's key ring came up missing from his car, with his car keys and apartment key. Both Pierre and Jefferson spent a good amount of time looking for those keys, but they weren't able to find them. The following day, Pierre came back over and suggested to Jefferson that they look for the keys again. It was during this search that they were able to locate the keys, and this made Jefferson suspicious of Pierre. So he did some digging. He found out that Pierre went to the locksmith on base and had the keys copied. Jefferson immediately contacted his landlord to have his apartment key changed and took his car key to have the key ignition changed out. He also confronted Pierre with this information that he found out the Friday before he was found. A witness reportedly seen them argue about it. Then, just 2 days later, Jefferson was murdered. Unfortunately, police did not have enough information to prove that Dale Pierre committed the murder. When police interviewed Pierre for Jefferson's murder, he was not helpful and at some points just refused to answer police's questions. So that's why they put him straight to the cell and didn't even attempt to question him. So about Pierre. Pierre got to Brooklyn in 1970 and worked a few different jobs, including a janitor and service clerk for a phone company before joining the Air Force in May of 1973. He went to boot camp in Texas and then was sent off to a training school following boot camp before reporting to the Hill Air Force Base in September or October of 1973. Pierre was put in for a discharge from the Air Force Base for basically failure to conform. His Air Force chain of command was supportive of this, as they reported that Pierre was nothing but problems. Both Dale Pierre and William Andrews were arraigned in court on 3 charges of first-degree murder. Now that Pierre and Andrew were in custody, they needed to try and find out where this $24,000 worth of stair equipment that was stolen went. Yeah, $24,000 worth of stair equipment in 1974. Just a big FYI, that'd be about $135,000 today. So police obtained a search warrant for both Williams and Pierre's barracks room. Nothing was found in Williams' room, but in Pierre's room, a list was found that showed different stereo equipment in Ogden, including what equipment was each store, and number 1 was the Hi-Fi store. There was this big show in the book about how one of the officers did not give up, which I'm super glad he didn't, but it was kind of a cliche movie type of shit. Everyone else left him in the room, moving furniture around his barracks room by himself to lift up the carpet. And wouldn't you know it, that the last corner to be lifted up would be a white envelope. Can you guess what was in this envelope? I bet you can't. It was a rental agreement between Dale Pierre and Wasatch Storage for a unit that was dated for April 22nd, 1974, the day of the murders, which at this point, when they found it, it was just 24 hours later. So police quickly get a search warrant for the storage unit, and they obtain the set of keys that Dale came in with when he was arrested, which, wouldn't you know, one of those keys was matching the lock to the storage unit. Police were thrilled when they were able to open the door and find the $24,000 worth of stereo equipment. Also found in the unit was a bottle of Drano and a cup, which they used to make the hostages drink the corrosive cleaner out of. Yeah, that was Drano. Drano they had to drink. As police investigated the murders, the name Keith Roberts came up. This was another airman that was stationed on the same base as Pierre and Andrews. He was actually with Pierre and Andrews the afternoon that the crime was committed, according to Andrews. He would actually end up getting arrested the Friday after the crimes were committed, and he was charged with concealing a weapon and tampering with evidence. Hey, editing Amanda here. I just want to say Keith Roberts is the correct name of the suspect. Sometimes I call him Kenneth Roberts. No idea why, but his name is Keith Roberts. Police would interview witnesses around the hi-fi store when they were able to find one that saw Kenneth in a maroon coat walking back and forth in front of the hi-fi store around the time of the murders, which was between 6 and 9 p.m. on April 22nd. Another witness outside the store saw Kenneth driving a light blue van dropping off Pierre and Andrews a little bit up from the hi-fi store. Another tipster called in to let the police know that while she was washing her windows outside of her home on Tuesday evening, the evening after the murders and the night that Pierre and Andrew was arrested, and she saw 3 black men outside of her home arguing. The way I imagined it wasn't really in front of her house, but like off to the side in a clearing area. Now, all of these witnesses basically confirmed that Kenneth Roberts was taking part in the robbery, so his charges were upgraded to aggravated robbery and first-degree murder. All 3 men would be tried together starting on October 15th, 1974, so just 6 months after the murders. The venue of the trial was actually moved from Ogden's to Farmington, which is only about 20 miles away. Keith Roberts testified on his own behalf on what happened that day. He said that at around 9 a.m. on the morning of April 22nd, he had gotten his 2 wisdom teeth pulled out and he went back to the barracks, only returning in the afternoon to the dentist to obtain more pain pills. After getting back to his barracks with the pills, he decided to sleep until Pierre and Andrews woke him up to go to the town of Ogden. Roberts drove around Andrew in a 1970 light blue van to look for apartments for him, his wife, and his new baby. After a while, Roberts said that he didn't feel well, so he dropped Andrew and Pierre off and waited in the van. He still wasn't feeling any better, so he says that he left the keys in the van and walked to a friend's house to give him a ride back to base. Roberts said that he got back to the barracks around 7 p.m. and was fast asleep by the time the killings were taking place. Roberts said he got back to the barracks around 7 p.m. and was fast asleep by the time the killings took place, even though that was between like 6 and 9. I don't believe that Andrew testified. I couldn't find out much either way because this trial did happen in 1974. But his defense during the trial was that he was there during the robberies, but he left before Pierre killed anyone. Pierre did not take the stand in his own defense. He said later that this was because he did not want to, because he would have to implicate other people. And the Bible says something about how you can't testify against another man and send him to death or something along those lines. I'm not too religious, so I'm not exactly sure what he was talking about, but I feel like this was an excuse of why he didn't want to get on the stand. However, Pierre's defense was the initial description given by Orren was not correct. I guess he said that the shorter man was 5'9" when Pierre is actually 5'6", something along those lines. Orren Walker did testify about how when he walked into the robbery, he was able to identify Dale Pierre as a smaller man, how they forced him to drink Drano, how Michelle and Cortney begged to live, saying they were too young to die, how he shot Carol, Courtney, Stanley, and then himself, how Pierre raped Michelle right before he shot her. He also testified it was Pierre who kicked a pen into his ear 3 times. A few more witnesses were called to the trial to provide the jury with more evidence. A teenage witness testified that he was in the hi-fi store the Saturday before the shooting, and he confirmed that both Pierre and Andrews were in the hi-fi store that day. He saw Andrews taking things over to Stanley in the sound room and Pierre walking through the store writing on a piece of paper. He remembers Pierre so well because Pierre asked him if he worked there. Another man testified that he worked as a ticket taker on base. So basically he was a sergeant by day at the Hill Air Force Base, and at night he was a ticket taker at the movie base theater. He said that he saw a man come into the movie theater on April 2nd to see a movie. He remembers seeing the name Pierre on the man's uniform because the day prior to that, he took a phone call for a man named Pierre with the last name Pierre on base and realized that there was only 2 Pierres on the entire base. He said that the movie that Pierre saw was Magnum Force, which I guess is a Dirty Harry movie. In the movie, a pimp gives a prostitute Drano to drink, except that the woman dies quickly after drinking the Drano. Now, Pierre would later say during a hearing that he noticed the Drano was in the bathroom at the hi-fi store. Due to this testimony, it was actually believed that they brought it in with them with the idea of killing people with the Drano. When that didn't work, Pierre just shot them. Another man testified that Andrews told him that he was going to rob the hi-fi store and that anyone they encountered would die. Another indicated that they were up to no good that night. Both Pierre and Andrew had gotten into trouble for something unrelated to the murders and were supposed to be at muster for extra duty every 2 hours. Muster is like when you meet every 2 hours. That's normally a military thing. Most of us have been there once where you have to muster every 2 hours, so they keep track of you. They did not show the night of April 22nd, 1974. An owner of another stereo shop testified that just before the murders, a group of 6 or so black men came into the shop. He remembers this because the men were acting out and he had to ask them to leave, and they refused. He confirmed that Dale Pierre and William Andrews were 2 of those men. A few sources mention between 6 and 8 people took part in this robbery, meaning from scoping out the place to the actual robbery to helping unload the equipment. However, these 3 men were the only ones that were ever charged. They also talked about how 2 guns were used during the shootings. They found casings from both a .38 caliber and a .25 caliber, and these were also found in the casings in the dumpster outside the barracks that Pierre and Williams stayed at. And to be honest, I'm not sure if Robert stayed in the same barracks as Pierre and Williams, but at least I know these 2 stayed at this one with the dumpster with the casings found. However, the 2 murder weapons were not found. A doctor of Cortney's and his father, Byron Naisbett, both testified about the injuries that Cortney had and how long it's been for him to recover. The defense attempted to make Cortney testify, but at this point, he couldn't remember that day in April. He actually couldn't remember that day in April until the end of August. Like that entire amount of him recovering is just gone from his memory. After about a month of testimony, it was time for the all-white jury, which included 11 men and 1 woman, to deliberate, which they did for about 10.5 hours before they returned a guilty verdict for both Pierre and Andrews on 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated robbery. Roberts was found not guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, but was found guilty of aggravated robbery. I looked into it, and I guess the 2 charges of aggravated robbery is 1, he was stealing stuff from Stanley because Stanley, was in charge of the store that night. So it was basically stealing the audio and the stereo equipment. And then the next one was a watch was stolen off of Orren Walker. Keith Roberts was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, while both Pierre and Andrews were sentenced to death, which at the time was by the firing squad. It's reported that the same day that Dale Pierre and William Andrews was sentenced to death, Cortney was released from the hospital 266 days after the incident. Now, as I said, Keith Roberts received a sentence of 5 years to life. He ended up serving 13 years and got paroled on May 12, 1987. Before his release, he provided a testimony to the Board of Pardons, and during this, he confessed that he was aware that the robbery was going to happen. He actually admitted that he met William Andrews down in Ogden the day of April 22nd, 1974. He was looking forward to the robbery because he wanted to make some extra money. Remember, supposedly he was looking for an apartment for his wife and child at this point. However, he stated that he was unaware that anyone would be in the shop at the time of the robbery. He thought it was going to be closed and empty. There were some talk from the sources about the mastermind being Roberts, but in other sources, they thought it was Andrews. After Roberts got out of prison, he moved back to his home state of Oklahoma, where he ended up dying due to a self-inflicted gunshot wound on August 8th, 1992. Now, at some point during the appeals process, for those who are unaware of the death penalty, it's a long time from the time that they are sentenced to death normally to the time they're actually put to death because of the appeals process. During one of the appeals, it was brought to the attention that the trial jury was all white, and while the trial was happening, a napkin was found by a jury member saying, "Hang those N-words." It didn't say N-words, but I'm definitely not saying that. Even the NCAA tried to fight for a new trial for the men as they felt that the white prisoners were not sentenced to death for murder crimes. In the book written by Gary Kinder, Pierre provided his side of the story during a psych evaluation to find out if he was competent to stand trial. He said that the storage locker was in his name because some of his friends gave him money and told him to go get one. So he did. The evening of the 22nd, he said that his friends did drugs that night, which he did not do drugs because he was too good for that. Pierre often thought of himself, I guess, as being better than those around him. He legit said that he found himself superior to other Black people. He said that. Throughout his prison sentence, Pierre changed his name roughly 27 times, ending with P. Dale Shelby, I believe. He also created a business while he was in jail because he was still dreaming about being wealthy, even on death row. This was something that was big with Pierre. He was trying to figure a way to become rich ever since he got to America. After all his appeals failed to grant him a new hearing or a new trial, he had a clemency hearing in 1987 where he begged for them to give him a stay and commute his death sentence to life in prison. During this hearing, he finally admitted that he did force each of the 5 people to drink Drano, and he shot all of them. He said that when he came to America, he learned what prejudice was, and it was so much built up hatred inside of him that he pushed it out onto those 5 people. He said that it all started once Carol Naisbett got there and called him an Edward. So he ended up shooting her right away. Then he ended up shooting the others because of how they were breathing due to the Drano. Like he was helping them out or some shit when he was the one that gave them the Drano. Well, his plea for clemency was denied, and he was executed by lethal injection on August 28th, 1987. He was pronounced dead just after 1 p.m. at just 34 years old. So at the time of his execution, Andrews was the longest prisoner on death row in Utah history at 18 years. He submitted appeal after appeal, begging for a life sentence because, according to his argument, he was not the shooter and that he had left right before Pierre started shooting. However, the prosecution was not about this at all. They said that Pierre helped administer the Drano, which would eventually have been deadly on its own. The night of Andrew's execution, he was originally brought back to the execution room, strapped to the gurney, and then they received a call advising the staff that there was a stay. So Andrew was brought back to a cell where he would wait for word on what was next. But he didn't have to wait too long. About an hour and a half later, he was brought back to the execution chamber and put on the gurney. He was put to death by lethal injection and pronounced dead at 3:56 p.m. on July 30th, 1992. No, this was 1 week before Kenneth Roberts killed himself. At the time of his death, he was 37 years old. Andrews did get caught with 10 other inmates attempting to escape. I couldn't find too much on this other than it happened in 1986 and an escape was planned. I couldn't really find too much on Andrews' life either other than what happened in his military career and that he is a native of Jonesboro, Louisiana. So Cortney Naisbett, although survived the incident, he had many problems that lasted the rest of his life. He was touch and go for a few months, as doctors would put it, on the verge of death constantly. He had to relearn a lot of things. When he was finally at the point he could return to school, he doubled up on his classes to be able to graduate with the class he was supposed to. It was a touching moment in the book when the entire room stopped and applauded him for everything he had overcome. Before that night, Cortney solo flew an airplane for the first time. He had been going for his pilot's license, and according to his flight instructor, he did amazing on his first solo. Sadly, though, Cortney never remembered that day, that flight, or how to fly anymore. He had to give up his big dream of being a pilot. With the help of his father, Byron, he was able to eventually live on his own, and he even got married. Thankfully, in my own opinion. Cortney does not remember that fateful night. He said he remembers a few things like being stopped in the doorway by a man with a gun, shouting to stand as they both laid tied up on the floor, and hearing his mother's voice at the top of the stairs, and he remembers the look on her face before she was shot. Cortney ended up passing away on June 4th, 2002 from a long-term illness, no doubt the Drano he ingested and the bullet to the head he took. One of the biggest things that I took away from the book is how Cortney's father was so angry about how the victims do not get anything. He explained that the perpetrators, Pierre Andrews, get all these rights. However, his son was basically left out to dry after he was almost murdered. Orren Walker ended up passing away on February 13th, 2020. And so that wraps up that case. Now, tell me in the comments, is this one that you've heard before? I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of feelings about this case. I think that it is brutal and heinous, and I think that although I do not support the death penalty, that if there is a death penalty, that this would be for who it's for. But on that note, until the next video, please stay safe out there. The world can be an ugly place.